Billionaire Ethan Blackwell never believed in love. Marrying a homeless woman was just an act of charity, a deal without emotions. But Lena wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. She touched his soul, challenged his heart, and soon he realized he was falling. But was it too late to win her back? The city was drowning in golden lights as evening settled over New York. The skyscrapers gleamed like towering giants, their glass windows reflecting the brilliance of a world built on wealth, power, and prestige. And at the top of one such tower stood Ethan Caldwell, a man who had everything except a heart that could feel, dressed in an impeccable black suit, his chiseled jawline set in its usual unreadable expression. Ethan gazed out the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse. He wasn't admiring the view. His mind was elsewhere. His PR manager, Victor Langley, sat across from him, flipping through a file with a smirk. "This is the perfect move, Ethan," Victor said, placing a set of documents on the glass coffee table. "Marrying a homeless woman will skyrocket your public image. People will see you as a compassionate billionaire instead of the ruthless businessman they think you are." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. Marry a homeless woman? The idea was absurd. "I don't have time for fairy tales, Victor," he said coldly. Victor chuckled. "It's not a fairy tale, it's a strategy. Marry her for a year, do some charity work, and when the world has been fooled into believing you have a heart, we file for divorce. Clean, simple." Ethan's blue eyes darkened. He never let emotions interfere with business, and this was just another transaction. Love didn't exist in his world, only power did. "Fine," he said flatly, picking up the contract. "Find me a homeless woman, make it happen. A life of struggles." The woman who had nothing. A few blocks away, amidst the dimly lit streets, Lena Carter wrapped her thin coat tightly around her shivering body. The December wind cut through her like a blade. She sat on the cold pavement, her arms around her knees, watching the world pass her by. She had once dreamed of a beautiful life, a warm home, a family, love. But dreams didn't feed empty stomachs. A woman dropped a few coins into her cup without looking at her. Others walked past, some with pity in their eyes, others pretending she didn't exist. Lena wasn't weak. Life had made sure of that. She had fought to survive every single day, but tonight, as hunger clawed at her insides and exhaustion weighed her down, she felt like giving up. And then a black Rolls-Royce pulled up. The door opened, and a sharply dressed man stepped out, Victor Langley. "Are you Lena Carter?" he asked, his tone businesslike. She blinked at him in confusion. "Who's asking?" He smiled. "Someone who wants to change your life." A deal with the devil. Lena sat in the opulent lounge of Ethan Caldwell's penthouse, her fingers gripping a steaming cup of hot chocolate. She couldn't understand why she was here. Then he walked in. Ethan. His presence was overwhelming, commanding. He moved with the kind of confidence only men born to power possessed. His crisp white shirt hugged his broad shoulders, and his piercing blue eyes locked onto her with an unreadable intensity. Lena swallowed hard. Why did a man like him need anything from a woman like her? "You must be wondering why you're here," Ethan said, sitting across from her. His voice was deep, smooth, and emotionless. She nodded. "I need a wife," he said bluntly. Lena nearly choked on her drink. "Excuse me, a contract marriage," Ethan continued as if he were discussing a business deal. "You marry me for a year, you get financial security, a home, a new life. In return, you play the role of my loving wife in public. And when it's over, you walk away with a generous settlement." Lena's heart pounded. This had to be some sick joke. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't need to," he replied coldly. "I just need the world to believe I'm capable of love. You need a way out of this life. It's a win-win." Lena stared at him, emotions warring inside her. "Why me?" she whispered. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. Because you have nothing to lose. A chill ran down her spine. Was this the price of survival? Selling herself to a man with ice in his veins. But what choice did she have? Homelessness, starvation, or a year as a billionaire's wife? Taking a shaky breath, she looked into his eyes and whispered, "Okay, I'll do it." And just like that, her fate was sealed. Lena Carter never imagined she would wear a wedding dress, especially not like this. As she stood before the grand mirror in a luxurious bridal suite, she felt like a stranger in her own reflection. The gown was breathtaking, a cascade of ivory silk that hugged her delicate curves, its intricate lace shimmering under the soft golden light. It was a dress fit for a queen, yet she felt more like an imposter. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her touch hesitant. Was this really happening? A week ago she had been sleeping on a park bench, her only possessions fitting into a torn backpack. Now she was about to marry a billionaire, a man who looked at her like she was just another business deal. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. Evelyn Caldwell, Ethan's mother. Lena tensed as the older woman's sharp, icy gaze swept over her. Evelyn was the epitome of high society, draped in a designer dress, pearls resting elegantly against her neck, and an expression that made Lena feel like a stain on a perfectly white cloth. "So you're the girl my son chose," Evelyn said, her voice laced with quiet disdain. Lena swallowed hard. She had been expecting this. Ethan hadn't introduced her to his family, not properly. This was a transaction, not a love story. "I suppose it doesn't matter," Evelyn continued, adjusting the cuff of her bracelet. "This arrangement won't last. Ethan is not a man who loves, he's incapable of it." Lena clenched her fists at her sides. She wasn't naive, she knew what this marriage was, but hearing those words stung more than she expected. "I know," Lena said softly, lifting her chin, "and I'm not here to change him." Evelyn's lips curled into a cold smile. "Good, then let's get this farce over with." The coldest vows. The wedding ceremony was nothing like a fairy tale. There were no whispered confessions of love, no nervous laughter, no stolen glances filled with secret longing. Instead, there was a billionaire in a tailored tuxedo, standing at the altar like he was closing a business deal. Ethan Caldwell looked breathtaking, his midnight black suit emphasizing the sharp angles of his jawline. His ocean blue eyes, so full of calculated indifference, held no warmth as he watched Lena walk down the aisle. And yet, for a fleeting second, something shifted in his gaze. A flicker of curiosity, an unreadable depth. Lena's heart pounded. Was it possible that beneath all that arrogance, all that emotional detachment, there was something more? As she reached the altar, Ethan extended his hand. His touch was firm, steady, but there was no tenderness, no reassurance. The officiant began speaking, but Lena barely heard the words. Her pulse roared in her ears as she stood beside the man who would be her husband for a year. And then came the vows. Ethan's voice was calm, cold, controlled. "I, Ethan Caldwell, take you, Lena Carter, to be my lawfully wedded wife. In sickness and in health, for better or worse, until we decide this arrangement no longer benefits us." A few guests chuckled quietly. Others whispered behind their hands. Lena's throat tightened. Even now, in front of a room full of people, he made it clear, this was nothing more than a contract. But she wouldn't let them see her falter. She lifted her chin and spoke her vows with quiet determination. "I, Lena Carter, take you, Ethan Caldwell, to be my husband, for as long as this lasts." And just like that, they were pronounced husband and wife. Ethan didn't hesitate. He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers in a kiss so brief, so emotionless, that it felt more like a signature at the bottom of a contract. Lena's heart should have remained untouched. But as Ethan pulled away, she felt something stir deep inside her. A dangerous longing. A quiet ache. What had she just done? The first night, two strangers under one roof. The mansion was too big, too grand, too cold. Lena stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, feeling suffocated by the overwhelming luxury. The golden chandeliers, the velvet curtains, the king-sized bed, it all screamed wealth and power, yet it felt hollow. She turned to face Ethan. He had loosened his tie, his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair. He looked every bit the arrogant billionaire, except for the tired shadows beneath his eyes. "This is your room," Ethan said, nodding toward the vast space. "Mine is down the hall." Lena blinked. "Separate rooms." "Of course, right," she said, folding her arms. "Wouldn't want to pretend too much, right?" His lips quirked at her sarcasm, but there was no real amusement in his eyes. "You know what this is, Lena," he said, stepping closer, too close. Lena's breath caught as his scent, rich cologne, mixed with something purely him, wrapped around her. "You don't have to be nervous," he murmured. Nervous, that wasn't the word for what she felt, it was something else entirely. Something dangerous. She forced herself to look him in the eyes. "I'm not." Ethan studied her for a moment before giving a slow nod. "Good," and then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Lena exhaled, feeling like she had been holding her breath for hours. This was her life now. Married to a man who felt nothing, while she, despite everything, was starting to feel too much. The morning after their wedding, Lena Carter woke up alone. For a brief disoriented moment, she forgot where she was. The silk sheets were too soft, the air too warm, and the bed far too empty for a newlywed woman. And then, reality struck like a cruel whisper. She wasn't a real wife. This wasn't a real marriage. With a sigh, she rolled out of bed, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. The room was too extravagant, too grand, too impersonal. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't hers. Nothing in this world belonged to her, not even the man she had married. Breakfast with a billionaire. Lena hesitated before stepping into the dining room. The long mahogany table was fit for royalty, stretching across the room like something out of a palace. The floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in golden morning light, and at the head of the table, dressed in a crisp white shirt, with the top button undone, sat Ethan Caldwell. He was reading the financial section of the newspaper, his posture relaxed yet commanding. A steaming cup of coffee rested near his hand. He barely acknowledged her presence. Lena clenched her jaw. So, this is how it was going to be. Fine. She moved to sit, but before she could, a maid hurried forward. "Ma'am, let me pull out your chair for you." Lena froze. "Ma'am," the title felt foreign, uncomfortable. "I can do it myself," she muttered, pulling out the chair. Ethan's gaze flickered toward her, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "You should get used to it," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "You're a Caldwell now. People will treat you differently." Lena scoffed. "Right, because calling me ma'am suddenly erases the fact that I was homeless last week." For the first time that morning, Ethan actually looked at her. Something in his gaze shifted, not pity, not cold indifference. "Something else, you don't have to remind me," he murmured. Lena narrowed her eyes. "Don't I?" His jaw tightened. "Eat your breakfast, Lena." Her hands curled into fists. He was always like this, calm, collected, unreadable. And it frustrated her, because he made her feel too much, while he seemed to feel nothing at all. The first spark of fire later that day, Lena found herself in one of the mansion's endless hallways, feeling like an outsider in her own home. She wasn't sure where she belonged. It weighs haze, Mr. Sep. She wasn't a real wife, she wasn't a guest, she wasn't a maid, and then, she heard something, a deep frustrated sigh. She followed the sound to Ethan's study, where the door was slightly ajar. Inside, he was pacing, his usual composed expression replaced with something rare, agitation. Lena hesitated, before knocking lightly. Ethan, he turned sharply, his blue eyes darkening. Lena Farr, what do you want? She almost stepped back at his tone. But she didn't. Instead, she crossed her arms. Maybe I just wanted to see if my husband was still alive. Something flickered in his gaze, the ghost of amusement, quickly buried. I'm fine, he said, turning away. But Lena had seen it, the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched like he wanted to punch something. Before she could stop herself, she walked toward him. Too close. You might be able to fool the world, she said softly, but you can't fool me. Ethan stilled, the air between them shifted, something tense, something electric, his gaze locked onto hers, something raw and dangerous simmering beneath his usual control. For the first time, Ethan Caldwell looked human. And Lena Carter felt like she was playing with fire. The moment he sees her differently, that evening, Ethan sat in the garden, a rare moment of solitude. The city skyline twinkled in the distance, but his mind was restless. He was used to control. Power, nothing ever unsettled him. But Lena, she wasn't supposed to affect him, and yet when she had looked at him earlier, challenged him, seen through him, something inside him had cracked. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Lena, she was wearing a simple white dress, the fabric dancing around her legs in the evening breeze. The golden light of the lanterns cast a warm glow on her face, making her look almost ethereal. Ethan's breath caught. He had never noticed before, not really, how beautiful she was. Not in the obvious way. Not like the women he was used to, the ones who wore expensive dresses and designer perfumes. Lena was different. She was all fire and vulnerability, strength and softness, and for the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't as unaffected by her as he had thought. The first crack in his armor. Lena hesitated before stepping closer. Mind if I sit? Ethan gestured to the seat beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, the cool night air wrapping around them. Then without thinking, Ethan reached out. Just a simple movement, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. But when his fingers brushed against her skin, Lena shivered, and Ethan felt it, the way her breath hitched, the way his pulse betrayed him. Their eyes met, a collision of fire and ice, of hesitation, and something dangerously real. For the first time, Ethan wasn't sure who was playing whom. And for the first time, Lena wasn't sure if she was still pretending. The days after their wedding were supposed to be simple, a carefully constructed act of a marriage for the public eye. But nothing about this felt simple anymore. Ethan Caldwell wasn't supposed to notice his wife. And yet, he did, too much. The dinner that changed everything. The air in the dining room was thick with tension. Lena sat across from Ethan, poking at her food, barely touching the gourmet meal prepared by the world-class chef. She didn't belong in this world of chandeliers and fine china, and she knew it. Ethan, as usual, was composed, eating in silence. But tonight, he was watching her, not in the cold, indifferent way he usually did. There was something else in his gaze, something heated, something dangerous. Lena set down her fork. Are you going to keep staring at me, or should I start charging you for it? Ethan smirked, the kind that was almost too smooth. Almost. Do you always talk this much at dinner? He asked, sipping his wine. Only when I feel like I'm being examined under a microscope, she shot back. He leaned back in his chair, a glint of amusement flashing in his blue eyes. I'm just trying to figure you out. Lena crossed her arms. Good luck with that. The words were meant to sound playful, but they held a deeper truth. She wasn't easy to figure out. She wasn't like the women he knew, the ones who played the game of wealth and power so effortlessly. And Ethan was beginning to realize that intrigued him more than it should. The unexpected dance later that night. As the mansion settled into quiet luxury, Lena wandered into the grand ballroom. Mitra train, the travel train dans mode. She wasn't sure why she was there. Maybe because it was the only place in this house that felt big enough to hold all her swirling emotions. Soft music played from the speakers, a slow haunting melody that wrapped around her like a whisper. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel, and then she sensed him. When she turned, Ethan stood in the doorway, his presence commanding yet strangely soft. "You dance?" he asked, his voice low, unreadable. Lena tilted her head.
Do you?
His lips twitched. "Only when I have to." Something in the air shifted. She extended her hand, half expecting him to refuse. But he didn't. Ethan closed the distance between them, his fingers sliding against hers, warm, strong, sending an unexpected shiver up her spine. He pulled her close, too close. Lena sucked in a breath, as their bodies aligned, her heart pounding at the warmth radiating from him. Ethan's hand rested against the small of her back, firm but careful, like he wasn't sure how much to hold, how much to let go. They moved in slow, deliberate steps, the music fading into the background. For the first time since this arrangement began, it didn't feel like an arrangement, it felt real, dangerously real. Lena's breath hitched when Ethan's fingers brushed against the bare skin of her back. The touch was barely there, but it sent a wildfire through her veins. "You're nervous," he murmured, his voice a deep rumble. Lena swallowed hard. "I'm not." Ethan's smirk was lazy, knowing none. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "What about you? Are you nervous?" His fingers flexed against her back, a subtle betraying movement. "No," he said, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. Lena smiled. She had found a crack in his armor, and she wasn't sure who that was, more dangerous for him or her. The almost kiss. The dance slowed, their movements stilled, but neither of them stepped away. They were too close, too lost, too caught in something neither of them wanted to name. Lena could feel his breath against her lips, warm, intoxicating. His fingers slid up her spine, stopping just below her neck, a touch that felt like a question, a silent burning hesitation. Ethan Caldwell never hesitated, and yet, here he was, caught between the urge to pull her in, and the fear of what it might mean. His gaze dropped to her lips, his grip tightening just enough for Lena to feel the conflict inside him. For a moment she thought he would give in, for a moment she wanted him to. But then, he stepped back. The air between them snapped like a broken thread, the sudden distance colder than the winter air outside. Lena's chest rose and fell, her heart still racing. Ethan's jaw was clenched, his expression unreadable again. The walls had returned. "This was a mistake," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. Lena swallowed, past the ache in her throat. "Then why did it feel so real?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer. Because he didn't have one. Lena lay awake in the massive bed, staring at the ceiling. She had been a homeless woman just weeks ago, surviving on scraps, avoiding the cold. Now she was wrapped in silk sheets in a billionaire's mansion, married to a man who didn't believe in love, to a man who had almost kissed her last night. Her lips still tingled from the ghost of what could have been, but Ethan had walked away, and that was the part that hurt the most. Ethan's war with himself. Ethan stood by the window of his office, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly. His knuckles turned white. What the hell was wrong with him? This was a contract, a game for the media, nothing more. So why did he keep thinking about her? Why had he wanted to kiss her? Ethan exhaled sharply. He needed control. He always had control. And yet for the first time in years, he was slipping. Because of her. Because of the way she smiled when she thought no one was watching. Because of the fire in her eyes when she challenged him. Because of how perfectly she had fit in his arms last night. Ethan drained the whiskey and made a silent promise to himself. This could never happen again. A storm, a fire, and a moment. They couldn't escape that evening. The weather turned. Dark clouds loomed over the estate,
thunder rumbling in the distance. Lena sat curled up in the library, lost in a book. She hadn't seen Ethan all day, not that she had expected to. After last night, he was avoiding her, and that was fine. Really, but then the storm hit. A loud crack of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered before everything went black. Lena's breath hitched. She had spent too many nights in the streets, trapped in the cold, terrified of the darkness. She wasn't homeless anymore, but the fear remained. She reached for her phone, but before she could turn on the flashlight, she heard footsteps, strong, measured, familiar. Ethan. The library door opened, and a moment later, she felt his presence. "You okay?" His voice was softer than usual, missing its usual arrogance.
Lena exhaled slowly. Yeah, just not a fan of the dark. She expected him to mock her, maybe smirk, and call her fragile, but he didn't. Instead, he sighed. "Come with me." Lena hesitated. "Where?" Ethan reached for her hand in the dark, his fingers warm, firm, grounding. "Just trust me," he said. And against all logic, she did. The firelight confession, Ethan led her to the sitting room, where a fire was already burning in the massive stone fireplace. The flickering glow cast shadows on his sharp jawline, making him look even more dangerous than usual. Lena sat on the couch, hugging her knees, the warmth of the fire soothing her nerves. Ethan stood for a moment watching her. Then, with a sigh, he shrugged off his jacket and sat beside her. Closer than necessary. Too close. The silence between them stretched. It should have been uncomfortable, but it wasn't. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "I shouldn't have danced with you last night." Lena turned to face him, her heart clenching at his words. "Why?" "Because you almost felt something." His jaw tightened. "Because it was a mistake." Lena swallowed past the lump in her throat. Why did his words hurt so much? She turned away, staring at the fire. "You're the most frustrating man I've ever met. You know that." Ethan let out a low chuckle. "I've been told." Silence again. Lena hugged her knees tighter. "Why did you marry me, Ethan?" His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You know why. Tell me anyway." Ethan exhaled, his fingers drumming against his knee. "I thought it would be easy," he admitted. "I thought you'd be easy to ignore." Lena's breath caught. "But you're not." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan turned, his gaze locking onto hers. "You get under my skin, Lena, and I don't like it." A shiver ran down her spine. "Then let me go." His hand moved before his mind could stop it, his fingers brushing against her cheek, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I can't," he murmured. Lena's heart pounded. "Why not?" Ethan's thumb traced the edge of her jaw, his eyes darkening. He was at war with himself, and she was the battlefield. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, and then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't slow, it was a clash of fire and frustration, heat and hunger. Lena gasped against his lips, her hands fisting in his shirt as Ethan pulled her closer, his body solid, warm, overwhelming. She had never been kissed like this, never been wanted like this. Ethan's hands slid down her back, gripping her waist, his fingers pressing into her, like he was afraid she would disappear. And in that moment, she knew they had crossed a line. There was no pretending anymore. Lena's breath was stolen. Ethan's lips were on hers, demanding, consuming, raw. She should have pulled away, but she didn't. Her hands clutched the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself as the heat between them surged like wildfire. His grip on her waist tightened, pulling her against him, the hard planes of his chest pressing into her soft curves. He kissed her like a man who had spent years denying himself every pleasure, like a man who had finally lost control. And Lena, she let herself fall. Her fingers slid into his hair, tugging slightly, and Ethan groaned, a deep primal sound that sent shivers down her spine. This wasn't gentle, it wasn't careful, it was a collision of emotions they had both tried to ignore. Then, Ethan pulled back suddenly, his breath ragged, his forehead pressing against hers. His hands remained on her waist, holding her close,
But his eyes, those stormy, conflicted eyes, they were at war. Lena, his voice was rough, like gravel and silk, all at once. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "You're pushing me past my limits," he admitted, his fingers tightening on her skin. Lena's lips tingled where his kiss had just been. "Then stop fighting it." Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't understand, then explain it to me," she whispered. But he didn't, because he couldn't. Instead, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones, as if memorizing her. Lena felt it then, the fear in his touch, the fear of wanting, of needing, of losing. And she realized something in that moment. Ethan wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what she was making him feel, the distance between them. The next morning, Ethan was gone. Lena woke up in their massive bedroom, expecting to see him, to talk about what had happened. But he had vanished. Not just physically, but emotionally. For days he avoided her. No lingering looks, no accidental touches, no teasing remarks. It was as if the fire between them had been doused in cold steel, and it hurt more than it should have. Lena told herself it didn't matter, that it had just been a kiss. But deep down, she knew better. She had felt the way Ethan had shaken in her arms. That hadn't been just passion. It had been something deeper, something dangerous. Ethan's internal battle. Ethan sat alone in his office, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. His mind kept replaying that damn kiss. The way Lena had melted into him. The way she had made him forget who he was. And that was the problem. He had spent his entire life being in control. And now, one woman, one stubborn, beautiful, infuriating woman, was breaking through his walls. He couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't. Because love was weakness. And Ethan had spent too many years building himself into a man who couldn't be broken. So he did what he did best. He pushed her away. Lena's breaking point. By the end of the week, Lena had had enough. She found Ethan in the grand sitting room, standing by the window, his hands in his pockets. He looked powerful, untouchable, distant. Lena's chest tightened. He had been so close to letting her in, and now, he was locking her out. "You're avoiding me," she said, crossing her arms. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I've been busy pretending nothing happened between us." Silence. Lena took a step closer. "I felt it, Ethan, and I know you did too." Still, he didn't look at her. "You're scared," she whispered. That made him snap. His gaze shot to hers, dark, dangerous, blazing. "I don't get scared, Lena." His voice was sharp, cold. Lena's heart ached. "Then why are you running?" Ethan exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "Because this wasn't supposed to happen." Her throat tightened. What exactly wasn't supposed to happen? The kiss, or the fact that you actually felt something? Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally, he stepped forward, slow, measured, until he was so close, she could feel the heat of his body. His voice was lower now, almost a whisper. "You think I don't want you, Lena?" Her breath hitched, his fingers brushed her arm, a feather-light touch that sent fire through her veins. "You think I don't dream about touching you?" Lena swallowed, his words unraveling her. "But I can't," he said, his voice strained. "Why not?" she whispered. Ethan's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a second, just a second, it looked like he might kiss her again. But then he stepped back, and it felt like a slap. "Because I don't do love, Lena," he said, his voice empty. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lena standing there, shattered. Because she knew the truth now. Ethan didn't just want her. He was terrified of loving her. The silence between them had grown into a storm. For days, Ethan avoided Lena. He hid behind business meetings, phone calls, and cold indifference. But Lena wasn't a fool. She saw the way his fingers twitched when she walked past. She caught the way his gaze lingered, when he thought she wasn't looking. She felt the tension crackle, every time they were in the same room. And yet he refused to surrender. Lena was done waiting. If Ethan Blackwell wanted to keep running, she was going to stop him in his tracks. The confrontation. Late one evening, Lena found him standing in the garden. The moonlight bathed him in silver, his sharp jaw clenched, his shoulders tense. She took a breath and walked up behind him. You can't keep ignoring me, Ethan. He stiffened but didn't turn. I'm not ignoring you, he said, voice devoid of emotion. Lena let out a bitter laugh. Then what would you call it? Silence. She stepped in front of him, forcing him to look at her, and when their eyes met, she saw it. The torment, the longing, the fire. He refused to let but. You kissed me, she whispered. You held me like I was the only thing keeping you from falling apart. Ethan exhaled sharply. Lena, don't, she interrupted, her voice trembling. Don't lie. Don't pretend you don't feel this. His jaw tightened. What do you want me to say? The truth. His eyes darkened. The truth is, I can't want you. Lena's breath hitched. You mean you don't want me? She challenged. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Something snapped inside him. With a rough growl, Ethan grabbed her wrist and yanked her against him. You want the truth, he rasped, his breath hot against her lips. Lena's pulse thundered. Fine, he whispered. I think about you every damn second. You are in my head, in my veins. You are driving me insane. Her heart stuttered. Ethan's grip tightened on her waist, his thumb tracing circles over her skin, making her shiver. But I can't love you, he murmured, almost to himself. I don't know how. Lena broke. Her hands slid up his chest, her fingers curling into his shirt. You don't have to know how, Ethan, she whispered. You just have to let it happen. His breathing turned ragged, his resolve crumbled, and then, he kissed her. This time it wasn't rushed, it wasn't desperate, it was deep, slow, consuming. Ethan kissed her like she was the air he needed to breathe. His hands explored her back, memorizing every inch. Lena melted into him, her fingers slipping into his hair, anchoring herself. Time ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of his touch, the taste of his lips, the way their bodies fit perfectly together. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwell stopped running. But happiness never lasts. That night, Ethan didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into his cold walls. He held her. For hours, they stayed on the balcony, wrapped in each other's warmth, whispering fragments of truth in the darkness. It felt real. It felt right. But deep down, Lena knew Ethan was still fighting himself. And when morning came, she feared he would run again. Lena woke up wrapped in warmth. For the first time since she had stepped into Ethan Blackwell's life, she felt safe. Her head rested against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat lulling her into a fragile sense of peace. She wanted to stay like this, forever. But reality had other plans. Because as soon as she shifted, as soon as she reached up to touch his face, Ethan pulled away, not abruptly, not harshly, but enough. Enough for her to feel the distance creeping in again. Her heart clenched. Lena. His voice was hoarse, almost regretful. She sat up slowly, searching his face. Don't do this. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Do what? Run. His jaw clenched. I'm not running. Lena's throat tightened. Then why won't you look at me? He said nothing. Because they both knew the answer. Last night, he had given in. Completely. For once Ethan Blackwell had let himself feel, had let himself want. And now, he was terrified. Lena reached for his hand. Ethan, please. He flinched. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but it shattered her, because it told her everything. You regret it, she whispered. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes stormy. No, then why does it feel like you do? Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Lena's heart pounded. Last night, it meant something. I know you felt it. Ethan swallowed hard. I did. Hope flickered in her chest. But it can't happen again. The hope died. Lena pulled back as if burned. Why not? Ethan's hands curled into fists. Because I don't deserve you. Her breath caught. He stood up suddenly, pacing, his movements restless. I don't know how to love, Lena. I don't know how to be the man you need. You don't have to be perfect, she cried, her voice breaking. I don't want perfect. I just want you. Ethan stopped. For a split second, she thought he would come back to her, but then, he turned away. and her world collapsed. I can't, he murmured. I won't. Tears burned her eyes. You're a coward, Ethan. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't argue. Because she was right, he was a coward, and so instead of fighting for her, for them, he walked away. Lena's breaking point. The pain was unbearable. Lena had given Ethan everything, her heart, her trust, her love, and he had thrown it away. No explanation, no second chance, just a cold retreat. She refused to let herself cry, but her chest ached. Her fingers trembled as she packed a small bag. Because if Ethan Blackwell thought he could push her away and still keep her in his life, he was wrong. Ethan's torment. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey in front of him. He should have felt relief. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? Then why did his chest feel like it was caving in? Why did his hands itch to reach for her? Why did he feel like he had just made the biggest mistake of his life? A knock at the door made him stiffen. James, his assistant, stepped inside, hesitating. Sir, she's leaving. Ethan's heart stopped. What? James cleared his throat. Mrs. Blackwell, she's packing her bags. Panic slammed into Ethan's chest. His vision blurred for a moment. She was leaving. She was really leaving. And for the first time in his life, Ethan felt helpless. The goodbye, that wasn't. Lena stood at the mansion's grand entrance, her small bag in hand. Her heart pounded in her ears. She wasn't running away. She was choosing herself. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the car waiting for her. But before she could get in, don't. The single word sent shivers down her spine. Slowly she turned. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, his breathing heavy, his eyes wild with emotion. She had never seen him like this. Vulnerable, desperate. Lena, he rasped, stepping forward. Her heart clenched. Why are you here, Ethan? He swallowed hard, his hands clenched. Because I can't let you go. Tears burned her eyes. Then give me a reason to stay. Ethan froze, the air between them crackled. This was it. This was his moment. Lena held her breath, and then Ethan did what he did best. He shut down. His face turned blank, his posture rigid, and with a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said, I'm sorry. Lena felt her heart shatter. She stared at him waiting,
Praying for him to take it back.
but he didn't, and so with tears streaming down her face, she turned and walked away. Ethan's regret, a man lost without her. The mansion was silent, too silent, too silent. Ethan sat in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The fire crackled in the background, casting flickering shadows across the room. But it brought him no warmth, because Lena was gone, and with her so was the light in his life. He had thought pushing her away was the right thing to do, that by protecting her from himself, he was saving her from pain. But he had been wrong, so terribly painfully wrong. His chest ached as memories of her flooded his mind. The way she laughed, soft, melodic, like the first breath of spring. The way she looked at him, like he was worth something. The way she had given him her heart, despite knowing how broken he was. And what had he done? He had destroyed it. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. Enough. He couldn't live like this. He couldn't live without her. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwell was going to do something not out of obligation, but out of love. Lena's pain, a love she couldn't escape. Lena sat by the window of her small apartment, staring at the city lights. She should have been happy. She had a new job, a place of her own, and a future that didn't depend on a man who refused to love her back. But her heart, it refused to move on, because it still belonged to Ethan. Even after everything, tears slipped down her cheeks as she hugged her knees. Why couldn't she stop loving him? Why did it still hurt so much? She closed her eyes, trying to push away the memories. But then, a knock on the door. Her breath hitched. It couldn't be. Her heart pounded wildly as she hesitated. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she opened the door and froze. Because standing in front of her, drenched in the rain, breathing heavily, as if he had run through a storm, was Ethan. The confession, Ethan finally, breaks Lena's heart, nearly stopped. Ethan, her voice was barely a whisper. His eyes, haunted, desperate, filled with something she had never seen before, locked onto hers. Lena, he rasped, stepping forward. She instinctively took a step back. What are you doing here? Ethan exhaled shakily, running a hand through his wet hair. He looked wrecked. I was a fool, he said hoarsely. I thought pushing you away would protect you. I thought I was doing the right thing. Lena's throat tightened, and now, his jaw clenched. Now I know that losing you is the only thing I should have been afraid of. Silence, thick, heavy, electric. Ethan took a deep breath, and for the first time in his life dropped every shield he had ever built. I love you, Lena. Lena staggered, her lips parted, her breath caught, her world tilting on its axis. What? His eyes burned into hers. I love you, he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. I love you so much, it terrifies me. I don't know how to be perfect, and I don't know how to be the man you deserve, but I know I can't live. Lena felt her tears spill. This was everything she had ever wanted to hear. But her heart still ached. You hurt me, Ethan. Her voice trembled. You made me believe it in her. Regret flashed in his eyes. I know, and if I spend the rest of my life making it up to you, I will. Lena swallowed hard. And what happens if you get scared again? If you decide I'm not worth it? Ethan stepped closer. The warmth of his body, the intensity in his eyes, the raw vulnerability
In his expression.
it all made her chest tighten. I will never make that mistake again, he vowed. I don't want a life without you, Lena. Not for a single second. Her lips quivered. His fingers brushed against hers, hesitant, pleading. Give me one more chance, he whispered. Let me love you the way you deserve. Lena stared at him, her heart pounding, and in that moment she realized something. No matter how much he had hurt her, she still loved him. Desperately, completely, always. Her breath hitched as she whispered, Kiss me, Ethan. His eyes darkened with emotion, and in the next second, he did. With everything, with every ounce of love, regret, longing and passion he had held inside. His lips crashed against hers, his arms wrapping around her as if he would never let go again. And this time, he wouldn't. Epilogue, love, real and forever. A year later, Lena stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the white lace of her wedding dress. Her heart raced, but this time, it was with happiness. A soft knock at the door made her smile. When she turned, she found Ethan standing there, dressed in his suit, looking at her with nothing but love. You're not supposed to see the bride before the wedding, she teased. Ethan smirked. I don't care about rules. I only care about you. She blushed. I love you, Ethan. He stepped forward, cupping her face. And I will love you for the rest of my life. A soft tear slipped from her eye, this time, a tear of joy. As he pulled her into a gentle, tender kiss, Lena knew this wasn't just a fairy tale. This was real. And it was forever.